All right. Well, hello and welcome back to Intro to Sociology. I've enjoyed reading your packback posts. Remember, you still have until Sunday night if you'd like to do that. Did want to point out a couple of things regarding the packback posts. One thing I forgot to put on the syllabus, which I'm going to update shortly, is that you need to post for a total of 10 weeks at your, of your choosing. So, if you don't want to post this week and you'd rather wait until next week, that's fine. Also, you can take a break, or if you get sick and can't post anything, whatever it might be. Keep in mind you have 10 posts, so that's one question and 2 responses each week that you plan on posting. So the other one thing I would mention about posting, it's pretty easy for me to tell when people have perhaps only looked at the lecture slides and have not listened or watched the actual video lecture. And I can do that because sometimes people ask questions that I have already answered in the lecture. So please, to reduce redundancy, make sure you watch the lecture and comment on that rather than perhaps just on the PowerPoint slides themselves. I think that's it in terms of announcements so far. We continue on today. So today I'm going to talk about communities. I'm going to be talking about communities and looking at some work by Nicholas Christakis. Not connected yet. I'll kind of go over the first chapter of that next week to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what social networks are, what social network analysis is, and so on. And so for this week, and actually for next week, you'll be reading the first chapter of Connected, but you'll also be reading the first 2 chapters of the coming neo-feudalism, as I discussed, and we'll actually be talking about the old feudalism today. Again, Nicholas Christakis, we read his book Apollo's Arrow, where he takes some of his social network analysis and applies it to the study of infectious disease, which, very important right now. Other things I just want to mention about Nicholas Christakis, he back in, I believe it was like 2014 or 2015 or so, he was at Yale University along with his wife, Erica, and there was a Halloween party where students were dressing in, white students were dressing as black students, painting their faces black, that sort of thing, the blackface and all that. And this was happening at a party off campus, and his wife wrote, some thing in the newspaper saying it's not really the job of the university to try to regulate, parties off campus. And he and his wife were, as a result of that, just pilloried by a number of students who saw them as not allowing a safe space to develop. I would side more on Christakis' side and his wife's, but in the big brouhaha that happened as a result, they left Yale, and I think he's fine with that. And he always gets asked about that, and you can watch him just roll his eyes, and he's so sick of talking about it, he'd rather be talking about social networks and stuff. So anyway, just kind of a little bit of historical background there. So today we start out actually by talking about some of his other research. Don't worry, we'll talk about other people too shortly. So he wrote a book called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. And when we talk about sociobiology, I believe next week or the week after, we'll kind of get into this a little in more detail. But what I think is important to know, at least right now, is that social organisms all have these interesting social network patterns, and they vary. These are ones for the Asian elephant, and these are for the African elephant. What they're basically saying is that for the African elephant, the African elephant, you have more density of connection. So the group, the herd, is more deeply connected. Again, get into this a little bit more when we talk about sociobiology. One thing that he points out is basically for a society, a community to work, you have to have these things he calls the social suite. You've got individual identity, and then from here on, like the x-axis, going from individual to collective, going from individual identity up to the societal value. So the individual itself, is not necessarily incredibly important for the social value, but things like family, love, and then you've got protections of in-group bias, and we'll talk about this later on in a lot of detail and look at some kind of interesting research that's been done recently. Friendship, cooperation, and then you get up to egalitarianism, social network, social learning. All of these things sort of enhance the value of these behaviors for the broader society. So one thing that Christakis does in this first part of his book, Blueprint, where I'm just going to go through some of his examples, is he's interested in how communities form, and particularly new communities, new societies. How do they develop, and how do you find a group to study if you're trying to study a new society, that sort of thing. Well, he came up with, in my view, kind of an ingenious way to look at it, and that was he divides into two groups, one unintentional communities and the other intentional. Unintentional communities, what's that? The best examples are shipwrecks. And there's interesting literature on shipwrecks. Back in the 1800s, there were a lot of novels and stories about shipwrecks and people being stranded. It was kind of like the hot literary thing of the time, the media that people were consuming. And so go through some of these shipwrecks, and they ended up with various success and failure, but there are some key things that underline, or I should say, key similarities across those cases that did survive, those communities, as well as those that did not. So one of the first ones that's discussed in terms of a kind of a good example is the Julia Ann. This was, let's see. Oh, one thing I should mention before I jump into this right now, we'll talk about this more next week, but sampling, trying to find a sample of people to study. You want to have a broad representative sample, so you would have people that would have never gone to the ocean, no desire to, as well as people that go to the ocean, that sort of thing. And so shipwrecks and some of these examples are not representative samples. I mean, it's a certain type of person that would become a sailor and things like this. Not all sailor attitudes don't necessarily represent the broader society. So, you have to kind of keep that in mind as you go through these. Nevertheless, as I said, there's, we have enough examples of people who were sailors that we can tell some interesting differences in terms of how the shipwrecks went. So the Julia Ann was going around the Isle of Scilly in the South Pacific, and this was 1855. Basically, you had 56 or 7 people total, and only 5 of them died, which is, actually a small number considering how devastating shipwrecks can be. The vast majority of shipwrecks have not had any survivors. So a few of the things, this was a ship that, they went to an island and basically were saved. This was kind of a successful community. Why was that? Well, it kind of started off with half the crew was Mormon. So that means that, you already have half the group that sort of believe the same things. They have their own perhaps hierarchy, that sort of thing. And then you have Captain Pond, I should just say Captain once there, Captain Pond, and this is key for the survival of communities. He was an altruist, meaning he did a lot to help other people, even at the expense or the risk of his own life. At one point, while he and the crew members were, grabbing people and throwing them into lifeboats, that sort of thing, a crew member had this big chest full of, at the time, like $8,000, which is, a lot of money today. It was a lot of money back then. And, he's got it, and he's ready to give it to the captain because it's the captain's chest of money. And the captain says, no, put that down and pick up that woman over there and get her in the lifeboat. So he really set an example of behavior. And so the other people that were in the hierarchy below him, mimicked his behavior. They tried to, be as helpful as possible. And that's what we often find is that one of the things you've got two factors that will lead to success. One is good leadership in the form of mild hierarchy. Mild hierarchy meaning, you've got people on top, different levels of, middle managers or whatever, going down to, the crew and the tourists and whatever. So you have a hierarchy there, but it's a mild hierarchy, meaning that it's not enforced through coercion. People aren't like beating each other, beating people down beneath them. The captain's not beating up the cabin boy, that sort of thing. So that tends to be kind of an essential ingredient for the survival of some of these communities. Friendships, obviously the 50% Mormon, you've got a lot of people who know each other and are friends. And then there's a kind of a third one, I guess, not just two, but reciprocal altruism, which is kind of what was going on, what you see happening in these communities that survive. People help each other, and then they help each other back, and so on and so forth. Another shipwreck was called the Blendon Hall. So this was kind of an interesting one. It happened oddly enough, they were stranded in 1821 on an island called the Inaccessible Island, although they were able to access it, but it was very difficult for other people to come and save them. So this was in the South Atlantic. About 77 out of 88 lived, so 11 people died or so. So not fairly successful considering the way things are. Again, you had a captain who had strong moral authority, had a moral compass. Captain Greig, I think. He noticed that there was a lot of tension between people on the crew and passengers, while they're on the island and so on, and kind of arguing about resources and whose turn it is to go pick some berries or find some leaves for toilet paper or whatever it is they needed. So there were tensions between the crew and the passengers. And then what happens is that at one point, a number of crew members just attack the passengers. And Captain Grigg, who you might think would be on the side of his crew, he didn't want much violence. So he recruited a number of passengers, and they were able to break up the fight and kind of detain the crew members who were trying to attack the passengers. He wanted to hand out the death penalty to them all, but basically decided not to. He felt that if he showed mercy to them, that perhaps that would strengthen the community, and he didn't want to be a Machiavellian and rule through fear. Interesting. You may wonder, how are these stories kept? How did they record these things? How do we know about them? Well, sometimes when they were rescued, they came back and were interviewed by newspapers. But there's a number of instances where you have crew members or people journaling using penguin blood, and so that actually is kind of. There's at least three examples where they kept a journal using penguin blood. I guess you have to be close enough to where penguins are, first of all. So, as I say, they break up the fight and so on. And over time, you get three groups that form. And they all made boats. One group went out and were never seen again. They crashed or sank at some point. Another one made it, and they were able then to send out rescuers. So that, for the most part, was another example of good leadership, trying to keep the peace as opposed to rule by fear and coercion, which, as we'll discuss in a later lecture, is actually not as effective as people sometimes think it is. Okay, another unintentional one was, I'm not going to talk too much about this one. This was an unintentional community again. It's kind of called the Sydney Cove wreck, where you had people basically wreck over here, and they ended up reaching where they wanted to go and had to walk 700 kilometers to meet the new colony. Let's see. So this was, this one then was the Invercalled, is what it's called, which wrecked on Auckland Island in 1864, kind of near Australia. And what is interesting about this one, what's very, very interesting about this, is that this example provides almost a perfect comparison. So this was Invercalled, a small island. Let's see, I have it written down how big it was. Yeah, Auckland Island in 1864, 26 miles long, 16 miles wide. So, not a huge landmass, but, fairly long and wide. What's fascinating is at the same time you had two shipwrecks happen on different sides of the island, and they never found out about each other. And the differences were quite striking. So the first one, the Invercalled, it crashes. There's 19 men who are left. After several weeks, basically, only two of them are left, and at the end of the day, it's the captain who, he's one of the two survivors. So what happened? Well, from the get-go, the captain made it clear that, he didn't want to waste any time trying to save anyone. That, if someone's hurt and injured, they're a burden, let them die. And so that's what happened. And, one man was initially injured as they were trying to get into shore, and he was left to die on the beach. So it becomes, more selfish. People are more selfish when they realize that, this is going to be a brutal hierarchy that they're in. Then at the end of the day, it was an officer and the captain, and they were basically ordering the other ones to do whatever, and having more of the resources for themselves, and so on and so forth. So it was a pretty disastrous situation. Interestingly, no mutiny. People may wonder, why didn't they just rise up? Well, sometimes, as we'll talk about later, people follow authority, and especially if you've been trained to follow authority, that's what happens. So, as I said, there was another shipwreck at the same time on the same island at the same year. Okay, so this was called the Grafton. And here you've got the 5 guys that were on the boat. Each of them are from a different country. So they basically all lived. There were, as I said, they were very diverse in terms of not just where they were from, but also their age. So, like, one was Italian, one was French, one was English, one was whatever, and so on. Basically, if you want to contrast them with the Invercalled, where they, someone was hurt on the beach and they just left him to die, you had someone who became, deathly ill at the beginning, and they helped them. They didn't just leave them to die. They cared for them, made them, maybe they got some cans of soup that they brought with them and made that for them, whatever it might be. So again, it was this initial act of altruism that kind of set the tone for how these 5 guys would work together. And they ended up, making a little hut and a chimney and, all these different things, tables and so on and so forth. And they all lived. And the captain and, kind of the highest officer were very resourceful. They wanted to help everyone, and everyone lived. And again, you have a diary written in seal blood. In steel blood, not penguin blood this time. Okay. Now, talking about other examples, another more recent example. Somewhat more modern example, I suppose. Let's see. Okay, so Sorry, I think I lost my notes of what I was looking for. Okay, well, I believe it was the early 1900s, Edward Shackleton, Ernest Shackleton, there we go. He put out this ad in a London newspaper: men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. So basically saying, anybody want to go on a life-threatening adventure? And a number of people did, actually. So they embark on this wild adventure where they start out here. Their ship is called the Endurance. They're at this like whaling place, and what Shackleton wants to do is sail through Antarctica. Basically, they thought maybe there would be passages, rivers kind of going through the ice, that sort of thing. So they head off down past the Sandwich Islands, heading downward, and then they start to enter pack ice, where the ocean is already freezing over, and they get stuck in it, and they basically drift along with the pack ice all the way down here until the ship actually gets trapped in the ice. They still have a couple of smaller boats that they can kind of carry around, but then they basically set up their tents and everything on the ice. So, then as I said, they kind of, get in this other smaller boat that they had. Oh, I'm sorry, no, they're still with the Endurance, and it's just kind of floating along through the ice. As you can see, they're leaving, going farther away from Antarctica. And then in October 27th, 1915, almost a year after they started, their ship sinks. And as I said, they have a few lifeboats, which they then use to get up to Elephant Island here. And that's when Shackleton and 5 crewmen decide that they're going to, get help somewhere, so they go to South Georgia, and I think they were actually trying to go over to Chile, and I believe this was like a mistake, but it ended up working okay, because they went 800 nautical miles to South Georgia. These are not big sturdy boats necessarily. So they arrive there, and they tell people about the rest of the crew. I forget how many were there, something like 128 people. I forget. There were a number of people there who, in total, I think everyone had to be together for 560 days. These ones were, left alone for another 130 days before, help came from Chile and rescued the entire crew and took them back. No one died in this example. Really kind of shocking, considering how long it was, and how dangerous it was. Literally ice cold water, that sort of thing. So again, why did they survive? Well, you can tell that Shackleton really cared about his crew, and he got in a smaller boat and went 800 miles to try and find help for his crew. And there was a lot of close cooperation between the people. You had a mild hierarchy that was set up. All those things that that make a community succeed. Another example of the mutiny on the Bounty. You may have heard of this. Maybe you've seen the movie or read about it. So the Bounty was a ship, and what ends up happening is that back up a second. First of all, this mutiny on the Bounty, it happens and people start up this society at a place called Pitcairn Island. And now this example has actually been studied by people who are thinking about space colonization to, constitutional government and all of these things. It provides a very interesting case study. Gender relations and stuff too, as I'll describe in a moment. So what happens, you have the Captain Bligh, who was overthrown, and 18 others were basically, given the bounty, while the others, basically went somewhere else. I can't remember exactly what the mutiny was for. Sometimes these things just happen. So anyway, they were cast onto a ship, and they navigated about 4,000 miles in 47 days. They made it to Tahiti, the island of Tahiti, and then what they did there, they were worried about the British arresting them for various illegal things, and so they wanted to, leave there as soon as possible, because Tahiti was technically part of the British Empire at the time. And so what did they do? They kidnapped several men and women, Tahitian men and women, and head out toward this Pitcairn Island, which at the time was very remote and unsettled. And there's a fairly inaccurate film about it called Mutiny on the Bounty. Very interesting story. It kind of, it's not what we would think of as a success. There's a lot of conflict and bloodshed throughout, but it actually stays together. The society grows, and more people are there to the point of today. And the people who live on Pitcairn Island today are the descendants of these mutineers and their Tahitian slaves, which is essentially what they became. So what happened then is that the white men basically chose, the Tahitian women they wanted as their brides, regardless if they were already married to one of the Tahitian men. And so over time you get a lot of conflict between the white men and the Tahitian men. And interestingly, the Tahitian women are sort of in between. And over time, it actually what ends up happening is that over time, you get basically the European men and the Polynesian men end up just murdering each other back and forth. And the last Polynesian man was killed by the women, actually, for killing their European husbands. And so, interestingly enough, the women over time felt more of an alliance to, these people had kidnapped them, and so on. Now, so as I said, it's kind of fascinating that when you look at the people who live there, they're, descended from this group of people who were, adrift, or not adrift, who were shipwrecked, or mutinied, whatever you want to say, and the slave people that they brought over as slaves, who later became part of the community. Now, there's kind of a sad ending to this story. It starts out kind of sad anyway, but in 2004, it was discovered that a number of descendants, male descendants, were convicted of rape and child abuse. And it kind of shone a light on this centuries-long culture of sexual predation of younger girls by older men. Basically, they would, as they said it, break in girls ages 10 to 12. So yeah, as I said, it's kind of, there are people there, so in one way you could say that it was successful, but it wasn't that successful. There was a lot of conflict. There was not a lot of cooperative impulses by the British that were there. They had a lot of racism toward the Tahitian men and women, and so that made them not want to cooperate, and so you get this sort of all against all sort of dynamic there. Okay, let's see. Now, kind of moving on to intentional communities. Let's see, one of them. Let's see if I lost. Okay, wait. Sorry. Okay. A good example is the Israeli kibbutzim. So kibbutzim is basically Hebrew for groups. So the first one was founded in 1910, and by 2009 there were 267 in Israel. Only about 3% of the population, of the Jewish population at least, are in kibbutzim. Nevertheless, they contribute about 40% of agricultural output and 7% of industrial. But 40%, I mean, that's fairly substantial. So the idea here was that these were early collectives, kind of socialist in their sort of egalitarian approach to things. And they tried a number of experiments. One of the things that they tried to do was collectivized childcare, so that, not just the biological parents, but it's, the village and the community that's raising the children. This has never actually worked well throughout history. I mean, you can read Plato was writing about it back in the ancient old days. You also had communist governments across the 20th century that tried it to some extent. All attempts end up getting abandoned. It didn't work by any of them, and it never really seems to. So by the 1960s and 1970s, most children were being cared by their biological parents rather than, the group. So another kind of interesting thing about this, and we'll talk about, the incest taboo, I believe next week. Yes, and one of the things is, people, this sort of biological and cultural resistance to incestual relationships. Well, what's kind of interesting is that we find this also amongst children that are raised together. They may not be at all related, but maybe they're neighbors, or, they have the same babysitter or whatever it is. And, from, I forget what age, around 6 or 7, if they basically have grown up amongst each other, kids who are not related, they start to have this sort of kinship relationship where basically you don't see these people, forming romantic relationships later on in life. And that was really in marked contrast to those kids who are not raised, kind of together all the time, playing together all the time, where, people would date across, groups and whatever. For people who are raised together, even though they were not biologically related, you still have the this sort of childhood kinship relationship develop. That's called the Westmark effect. As I said, I'll talk about that more next week. So, yes, this was kind of what I just said about collective child rearing. Just didn't really seem to work. They had dormitory arrangements for infants, and it just kind of petered out over time. Moving to the United States, you have a number of attempts back in the early 1800s, where a lot of groups were, for various reasons, setting up their own communities. Brook Farm is a good one. That's what it looked like back in 1861. This was a school that was set up by the New England Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists are a group of philosophers and thinkers in the United States in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, and they were basically trying to create a stronger relationship with nature and away from industry and materialism, that sort of thing. The idea that you would transcend your material needs to be closer to God and nature and that sort of thing. And so this had a huge influence on a lot of people. Henry Thoreau, the famous writer, goes and lives in a cabin that's actually not too far away from town. He goes back in town every once in a while, but he builds this cabin at Walden Pond, and he writes this book, Walden, about living on your own and how nice it is not to be distracted by the TV and stuff like that, and your phone going off. Big problem with David Thoreau at that time. Okay, so what you had then at Brook Farm was someone who's influenced by the Transcendentalists, a guy named Thomas Ripley. And so he and his wife and 12 other people, they set up this Transcendental Club that basically gets all these Transcendentalists together. They actually have a lot of gender equality, more so than you would find in most other social systems at this time. They had their charismatic leader who cared about the group, Thomas Ripley, that sort of thing. And what, as I said, one reason some of these communes don't work out is they try to break up the nuclear family, so you could have like collective child rearing. So at Brook Farm, they didn't do that. They didn't try to break up the nuclear family. People helped around the farm, this sort of thing. What caused it to fall? Well, after a while, the ideas of a guy named Charles Fourier became very popular and sort of were adopted by a number of the people at Brook Farm, but also was resisted by a number of people at Brook Farm. So Fourier was a socialist thinker at the time, and his communities that he advocated, he wanted them all to build this wooden structure they called a phalanx, I think, and basically, the whole group would get together and it'd be something that they worked on. Well, the people at Brook Farm, they built it, but they weren't really happy about it. They thought it was kind of a waste of time, waste of resources, energy, all of that. And so at a certain point, a group of them just lit it on fire. And you have the first Burning Man festival. Okay, so anyway, so that didn't really pan out too well. Oops, I did want to, before I jump into those, also the Shakers. They're another group that were formed in the 1700s in England. Their leader was, again, another charismatic leader. Her name was Mother Ann Lee. And in 1768, she becomes the leader of the Shakers, and she actually, by herself, changes Shaker ideology quite dramatically. So she had had 4 children die during childbirth, and she was completely devastated by it. And because of this, it radicalized her, and she didn't want other people to experience that. So celibacy becomes a major part of the Shaker ideology. So they thought of God as a man and woman, so again, very kind of modern in their views there. They also saw men and women as being equal, and racial equality as well, as long as everyone was Christian. So very progressive group for especially those times. Now, the problem, though, is when you have celibacy as a value in society, well, that means that it's going to be hard to, keep the group going after you basically have to recruit new members who are already adults, and you can't raise a family in the Shaker tradition, that sort of thing. So in 1968, someone did a study, a sociologist did some study of the Shakers that were left. There were only 19 of them left at that time, and they are all gone now. It's a Shaker community no longer exists. So then you get other intentional communities, more recent ones, the sort of hippie communes of the 1960s. So in the 1960s, a number of hippie urban communes are formed. By the late 70s, only about a third of the residents were still present at them. The main reason that people left is that they didn't want to feel, is that they did not feel loved by others there. Of the 60 communes that were developed in the 1960s, it's about 80% survived for a year, but only 63% survived for 2 years and less after that. 77% dissolved for internal reasons, ideological conflict, leadership disputes, that sort of thing. 23% for external reasons like threats and that sort of thing. So the ones that did work, you find that, for example, there's a sample done of these communities. 42% of residents in them did not have sex with other members of the commune, and of those who did, 71% were monogamous. The incidence of group marriage was very low, only 1%. So what happened here? What are the differences? Well, there are two features that determine group cohesion here in these communes. One is the structure. Who are the how do you develop feelings of a collective self and belonging and stuff like that. And then there's ideology, just the belief systems themselves. Okay, so one of the kind of early ones, actually, let me back up. Remember, I talked about David Thoreau writing the book Walden, where he goes off to the cabin. B.F. Skinner, the famous behavioral psychologist, who some of you may be familiar with, or if you take psychology classes, you'll undoubtedly learn about him. He was a behavioral psychologist, which means that he was really focused on how people make decisions based upon rewards and punishments. So, he was basically arguing that people are likely to learn language from watching other people talk to each other and that sort of thing. And I'll talk about why that approach is completely wrong next time. But the idea of behaviorism generally is you shouldn't waste your time trying to study what's going on in the mind. Just look at the behaviors and look at the external stimuli that will reward or possibly punish someone for their behavior. So it's kind of like an engineering model of psychology. And that's really what Walden 2 was. It's a fictional book where a professor is taking a group to this Walden 2 community, and then there's some specialist there who kind of explains how everything works. And it was very influential. A number of people actually set out to sort of mimic that. And one of these places was called Twin Oaks, which I believe is in Virginia, but don't quote me on that. That was started in 1967. They read Walden 2, and it became pretty clear within the first week or whatever that what Skinner had written about was almost impossible to bring about in real life, that it was just a bit too idealistic and so on. So they actually abandoned those plans pretty quickly. The biological parents had a strong role in children's affairs. Nevertheless, 1 out of 4 people left the commune after a year. But it is still going. As you can see there, people are dancing, having festivals, and so on. This is pre-COVID. I don't know what COVID has done to this community. That would be kind of an interesting sociological study for somebody to do. Anyway. Another one of these that was influenced by Walden 2 was Los Horcones, which is down in Mexico, but it was started, I believe, by a number of people from America. And they tried a planner-manager model, which is something you can sometimes see in city development, where you have kind of someone at the top who plans and manages things, and it didn't work out so well, so they kind of democratized things a bit, and actually has led to their commune being very successful, and it's still around today, as far as I know. You had a number of members who, when they started, they were already married, and so you already had these tighter bonds going in there. And again, you had a charismatic leader who was, somewhat selfless and that sort of thing. And that's, as we talked about, is a key ingredient. Now, talking about sort of new societies, new communities, artificial communities. One example would be Amazon Mechanical Turk, where it's kind of an online community of people doing various jobs and taking part in surveys and this and that. But I think an even more interesting example is video gaming. And, many games actually could be discussed here. World of Warcraft, one of the biggest games where you have this sort of artificial community, where in the game, some of you are, I'm sure, familiar with it, but in the game, players basically become these bands, and they're called guilds, and then they go around and fight monsters and get treasure and that sort of thing. So someone did a study of about 300,000 players, and they found that the guild sizes range from as low as 3 people to as high as about 260, with the average group size being about 17. But again, you have these relationships, that these hierarchies that are developed within the group, and it becomes pretty clear who's going to be a leader, and these things are sort of worked out internally within these groups. Again, there's been a lot of research on this area, some kind of things that we'll talk about more when we talk about race and stuff, but there's been studies that have been found that avatars, the people you create, the digital people, players you are, those avatars with a darker skin will be helped less often. So yeah, well, when we get into talking about race and prejudice and all that, we'll talk about why that happens, how that happens, that sort of thing. And this actually, this is kind of captured in this book that then became a movie, Ready Player One. I think some of you are familiar with it. Basically, it's set in the future, and I think it's like in Columbus, Ohio, and it was like the center of the world now. The world is just in ecological devastation, and nothing. There's just a lot of destruction of society and so on, and basically everybody lives in these kind of gigantic high rises built out of trailers from trailer parks and RVs and that sort of thing. But everyone also is able to go into this virtual reality world, and that's where a lot of people are spending their time because the real world is so awful. So again, it's what I like about this book is that it's kind of combined the gaming aspect that I just talked about with sort of utopian dystopian ideas and stuff like that. And, we could almost say that we're kind of like heading in that direction, at least perhaps a little bit, where we may not be able to afford to, the gas to drive or whatever it might be in the future, but maybe we can link together online. Interestingly, there's a book in Chinese science fiction work by Xijin Liu, The Three Body Problem is, I believe, the name of the trilogy as well. But the first book, you kind of have this going on too, where there are people who are meeting kind of like in secret or whatever, and they're doing it on this online platform, this virtual reality system. So anyway, a lot of people are thinking about this. Some very interesting stuff there. Okay, that's it for the communities part I just wanted to go through. I do have much more to get through, though, today. So here today, now moving on to discussing the history of sociology and the development. Again, I just want to say that, you can get either of these two copies. This is the more recent one. I think the only thing that's different is like the preface and maybe parts of the introduction, but for the most part, they're the same. So feel free to get whichever version you would like. And again, we'll be talking about neo-feudalism a bit today. And remember last time, the first day of class, we talked about anomie, this absence of norms. And remember, Emile Durkheim feared that industrial society could lead us to anomie, basically this division of labor that we have. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Well, before we jump into the development of sociology itself, I'll probably give credit where credit is due. Ibn Khaldun, famous Arabic philosopher and historian, politician from North Africa. He did a lot of traveling and recording of history and so on and so forth. And he made this argument for what he called a science of civilization, that, you could develop something like astronomy, people were studying the stars in the Arabic world, but apply it to people. And, this is about 500 years before the French philosopher Auguste Comte coined the term sociology. So we usually think of Comte as kind of the founder of the discipline. What he was doing in the early to mid-1800s was he was looking around his university and he was watching the biologists doing all this stuff. Chemists were coming up with all these new interactions and so on. The astronomers were making better telescopes and so on and so forth, all of these different things. And he thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could take that scientific approach and apply it to the study of groups, the study of human societies? And he called this sociology. Now, when we often think of classical social theory, we don't spend a lot of time on Comte. His stages of history of society are kind of out of date, don't really apply anymore. But there are theories that come from the main three top classical theorists from sociology. Max Weber, and we say Weber, even though it's a W, we pronounce it with the German V sound, Weber. Karl Marx wasn't actually a sociologist, but some of his analyses were kind of like sociological analyses, whether you agree or disagree with his conclusions. And then Emil Durkheim, who we've talked about and we'll talk about again. Important things to know about sociology. So sociology has, for the most part, kind of a Western bias in the sense that it was developed in the West. So what is happening before sociology is developed? Well, social structure in Europe at the time, there were two main authorities, scattered around: the various kings and feudal lords, and the church. And so the kings and the royals and stuff would fight each other all the time. And the church became more and more powerful, especially the Catholic Church. And you start to see all sorts of tortures. If you're ever in Europe and get a chance to go to a torture museum, a medieval torture museum, you should go. I mean, it's fascinating and frightening, disturbing, all at the same time. So in medieval Europe, the Roman Empire starts collapsing. You have different groups and hierarchies emerging. Over time, you start to see the property starts to consolidate into large manors where the nobles, were kind of at the top of the hierarchy, and then you had a lot of peasants at the bottom. And nobility had their own forms of subordination, where you had lesser nobles who were vassals to the more powerful lords, and they were often given a piece of land, which became hereditary, if they helped, the king or whoever, with their next war in France or whatever. Loyalty was the key aspect of society, of medieval society. We call this patrimony. And patrimony is basically where a person has the job they do in, say, government, not because of their qualifications, but because of their relation to the king or the duke of wherever. They were the cousin of the king, and so they get a good job because of that. The problem is that does not necessarily mean you have good qualified people making those decisions. So we can kind of look at these three estates that existed in the medieval time period. The first estate is the clergy. That's the clerics and the pastors and priests and so on. The second estate is the nobility. That's the lords and kings and etc. And then you've got the third estate, which is the commoners, which were primarily peasants, low-level urban merchants, that sort of thing. And, basically you have the king who owns the land, makes the laws, then you have the nobles who have, they agree to supply the king with soldiers when necessary. The nobles give some of their land to some of these soldiers. And then you have these various knights who then will fight for the nobles and for the kings. And then you've got, at the very bottom, the peasants. And the peasants basically work for the nobles in return for protection from, marauding other groups and so on. Now, the one thing that I do want to point out that the king is not perhaps as powerful as we sometimes think, especially during the medieval time period. the king was often very dependent on this second tier, because basically, if the king could not get the lords and nobles to, supply them with soldiers, that person wouldn't be king very often. Which is why you see so many, wars and kings being overthrown, people arguing about who's next in succession for the throne, that sort of thing. So the king actually, until you get later where the king actually does have significant power in like the 1600s, before that, a lot of kings aren't actually that powerful, or they have to really rely on their alliances with their nobles and so on and so forth. A great book that I sometimes use if I teach political sociology is States and Power. This is a good book about the history of the development of modern nation states. But it goes from like ancient history and prehistory to the modern era. So shortly after the fall of the Roman Empire, you start to see these manors and towns look like that, and then usually built out of wood. And over time, they were built from stone. So when you read, as you start reading The Coming Neo-Feudalism by Joel Kotkin, he's basically, he talks about feudalism a little bit, and he says, there are today the third estate, who are the peasants, they're kind of similar to the old yeomanry in terms of yeomanry were farmers on their own, essentially. So you don't see that as much today, but you see independent workers who live in urban and suburban areas. I think maybe like the Uber drivers and stuff like that might kind of be similar. People who are contracted out for their services. And then you also see the working class that is more like medieval serfs. He says we're becoming more and more like medieval serfs, where people don't have a lot of security, a lot of opportunity for advancement, things like that. In looking at European history, one of the big changes that happened that sort of, revolutionizes many things around the world is the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. Now, I do want to point out that it's not like European society went from like Rome, the Dark Ages, medieval reason. You basically had a number of nobles, aristocrats, people who had time on their hands, weren't working, and so on, who are sort of rediscovering ancient Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy, and jurisprudence. They're starting to become very influenced by the knowledge that is coming out of Asia, coming via the Silk Road, coming out of the Middle East, the Middle East at the time were kind of leading the world in terms of astronomy and numerology, numbers and math and that sort of thing. So the aristocrats in Europe, they were in a geographic place to kind of absorb a lot of these different influences. And it's from those influences that they start to question things like the monarchy. Is it really God who chooses the king or queen? Should people choose themselves? Is there a God? People start asking that, and so on and so forth. And over time, you get the development of the scientific method. But it's not as clear-cut. So we often think of, Isaac Newton as being a very important person for the Enlightenment, for the Age of Reason, by pointing out that there's a thing called gravity exists. That was one of the things he did. He actually spent a lot more time doing alchemy, which is trying to turn metals into gold, which never really doesn't work. But he actually spent a lot more time on trying to do that than he did by studying gravity or thinking about the cosmos, and so on. So you have this interesting mix of people who are still believing in sort of magic in some ways, or religious beliefs in some ways, and are kind of combining it with modern science. And you still see that across the world today in different ways. So as I said, it led to a lot of social change, political change. You have John Locke, who kind of lays out the different ideas about individual liberty and so on. You have Voltaire, who writes the book called Candide, where he kind of knocks the optimistic view of humanity and human history, saying that it's all pretty, brutal, and there's a lot of gore and bloodshed and so on and so forth. Edmund Burke, who I'll mention him more in a moment, basically, he is a British philosopher. He watches the French Revolution, is kind of horrified by the violence there, and, kind of responds. His writing is a response to that, saying basically, hey, maybe we need to have monarchs still or something, so we don't have this anarchy and violence that we see in France in the French Revolution. I did want to say that one of the ways in which a lot of the information flows into Europe is from the Silk Road. And I think I plugged this book earlier at some point. I'm actually in the midst of reading it right now. It is a fantastic book, talking about really, Central Asia, and just, how Central Asia is often just thought of as this place in between China and India and Europe. And, and the influence, and it has not been well laid out for an English audience. So this is a very welcome history book in my view. So when we do look at, what was going on in Asia at that time, kind of like in Europe, you had, powerful dynastic forces, Chinese dynasties, these large empires that sort of developed over time. The Tang is especially important. By, the Tang dynasty becomes essentially as developed as the Roman Empire had been a couple hundred years previously. So China has this very long history of dynasties, and that has kind of shaped society and, our understanding of sociology, Chinese sociology. As I said, that the Tang Empire consolidates a lot of the power and land and so on. China did well. They had a uniform written system. They had more cultural integration than in Rome. Confucianism becomes the basis for many aspects of the society. The Han Chinese, the dominant ethnic group in China, weren't able to maintain control over all the provinces because the Chinese army was not as centralized and disciplined as you would see in the Roman Empire. China also lacked a clear, uniform legal system regarding property and civil rights. Nevertheless, I said Confucianism, kind of main ideas of Confucianism is, it's very practical, it's very worldly, it's not a spiritual, religious belief system. It pays attention to individual virtue, and it stresses the traditional patriarchal family. So Confucianism becomes this sort of part of the Chinese education system. So basically wealthy Chinese elites had to learn Confucianism. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting, in the Europe, the Roman Empire collapses and you see the rise of feudalism. Now, the Chinese empires would collapse every so often, but they never developed a feudal system. Japan also had feudalism. China, why? And so the question is, why not? Why didn't they have a feudal system develop? The reason is because, unlike in Europe, China had a very standardized testing system. Basically, they had use their educational qualifications as the basis of appointment to positions in the government. Remember, this is not patrimony. Patrimony is where basically you're the cousin or the nephew of the duke, and therefore you become a lord of Essex or whatever. So they didn't have that, and so that is one reason why you see the continuity of the basic system over thousands of years. So Japan, interestingly, went a different direction than China. When China made contact with Western countries in the 1800s and 1700s, China kind of turned inward and didn't really want to have anything to do with them. And then as a result of that, were sort of colonized parts of China were colonized and so on. Japan went a different direction. After they first saw, sorry, the phone's going off somewhere. They saw, they realized quickly that they would not be able to militarily fight off these European powers. So they decided to modernize in the Meiji Restoration. And this is when Japan starts to adopt many Western practices, Western technology, and then become very powerful very quickly, to the point that, within a few decades, they're defeating Russia, and then they're, taking over large parts of Asia, fighting the United States, and so on and so forth. Because prior to the modernity, you still had a feudal system, the samurai system. The samurais were feudal lords, and the feudal system was in some ways similar but different to what we saw in Europe at the time. Again, it's they basically modernize. The samurais lose their status and essentially go from being these sort of warriors wearing armor and stuff to modern military wearing uniforms and carrying guns and so on. Okay, so that's just kind of a brief run into Asia for a moment. Going back to Europe and some of the thinkers that kind of paved the way for I'm back. Okay, so some of the thinkers that paved the way for the modern world for sociology. Well, an important figure is Adam Smith. Adam Smith, may or may not know him. He was a philosopher, a moral philosopher, also one of the first people to talk about capitalism and markets. And basically, he was arguing that you needed a market system. He has this famous quote: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." So what he's saying there is that the brewer isn't going to just brew up some beer and just give it to you because it's what they do. They like to do that. No, they're going to sell it and hope to make a little bit of profit, which they can then buy something else. And so his whole idea is, as long as you have prices there to sort of regulate the values and costs, then you will reach sort of an equilibrium. And so everybody is working in their own self-interest, but they're not necessarily being selfish. And that's one of the things that he talks about that sometimes contemporary people, fans of Smith, have kind of forgotten. Because his first book was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he kind of discusses, are you a good or bad person? What influences that? The second book, The Wealth of Nations, and The Wealth of Nations is a more popular book. It's where he lays out kind of the ideas of the capitalist market system, and he argues against tariffs and trade blockages. He says basically you need free trade in order to have free markets. Interestingly, when he died, he had returned to the theory of moral sentiments and was in the midst of revising it. So he's known more for this and for some of his economic ideas, but all of his economic ideas are tied to his moral outlook. That's something that a lot of people forget or don't know in the first place. If you want to think about it in terms of your modern world, I recommend the book How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, An Unexpected Guide to Human Nature and Happiness by Russ Roberts, who I believe still does the podcast Econ Talk. Auguste Comte, we talked about him already. I'm not going to spend much time on him as a result. But I do want to talk about the French Revolution, because the French Revolution is important for the development of social theory and sociology. So in 1789, you have the people of France overthrow the monarchy, and this was at the time, it had a much greater impact on European society than the American Revolution had. In the American Revolution, you had people, far away across an ocean kick out, the colonists, the British. They did not overthrow the British Empire or overthrow the king of England or anything. In contrast to France, in the French Revolution, you had the people actually rise up, overthrow the monarchy, and develop a new system of government. And as often happens, you get there's a lot of beheading, hundreds and thousands of people, monarchs and aristocrats and so on were being beheaded. And as often happens in revolutions throughout history, there'll be the revolution, and then as revolutionaries become more powerful, they start to go after people who are less revolutionary, who they deem as being less committed to the revolution. So after a while, they've been chopping off heads of the monarchs and aristocrats, and then they start chopping off people who are not revolutionary enough. Famous figure here is Robespierre. He was one of the people who really early on advocated for just, chop off their heads, off with their heads, the aristocracy, kill them. He later on himself was imprisoned and then beheaded by his comrades for, I guess, not being revolutionary enough or something. So that, again, as I said, that leads to huge changes, and all of a sudden you have people across Europe, monarchs and kings and queens, who are terrified that what happened in France is going to happen elsewhere. And Napoleon kind of tries to do that in an interesting sort of way. This is also Edmund Burke, who I mentioned earlier, the conservative philosopher. He's writing in response to this. He sees that the French Revolution is very bloody and gory, first against the aristocracy, but then against whoever is deemed not pure enough and not revolutionary enough, that sort of thing. And he's horrified by it. And his philosophy, which is now Burkean conservatism, is basically this idea that radical change can sometimes backfire completely and become horrible. And so it's better to have small changes, slight changes, not maybe go that radical route. At the time, there were also, as I said, a number of counter-revolutionary or counter-enlightenment thinkers. So even more than Burke. Burke was still fairly modern, but there were a number of people who were aristocrats, and they were monarchists. A lot of them were very religious. One of the best known, kind of the darkest in their sort of view of the world, is Joseph de Maistre. And de Maistre, basically, he was a Duke of Savoy, which is a small principality. He left France, I believe, during the Revolution, went to St. Petersburg in Russia, was like an ambassador there, and was just kind of monitoring what was going on from afar. And he was very concerned about the fall of monarchies, and saw this as an attack on Christianity, which was the paramount thing in his mind, and so on. Another aristocrat at this time, Francois René de Chateaubriand, he was not nearly as, his writing was not nearly as like dark and pessimistic as de Maistre's was, but his focus was more on what do people do for leisure, and how should people spend work and their time working and playing, and how do we develop these sorts of systems. So he wanted to maintain a monarchy, the aristocracy, but he wasn't perhaps as dedicated to radical change as de Maistre was. So this then leads to what we would call modernity. It generally refers to the social outlook after the Enlightenment, as democracies and capitalism became the dominant social systems. And a great book on this is called The Roads to Modernity by Gertrude Himmelfarb, famous kind of neoconservative writer, the mother of Bill Kristol, not the actor, but the conservative writer Bill Kristol. Anyway, Gertrude Himmelfarb was his mother, and she has done a lot of work in this area. Okay, and I think I'll start there. We'll jump into the Industrial Revolution, then talk about Marx, Durkheim, Weber, the other social theorists on Tuesday, and then we'll also be also talk about the first chapter in Connected. Make sure that we all are on the same page regarding the different assignments. Make sure we're all on the same page regarding that. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone, and remember to post a question and respond to two of your peers, either about lecture or about readings, whichever you prefer, but make sure you do that by Sunday night. All right, everyone, have a good weekend.